joining us today. Thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate this. This is the first of our lecture series, very first collaboration between the art department and the sustainability department. And we're super thrilled to have so many lovely people here, so many familiar faces. This is just really wonderful. And we're so excited to invite Alvarro to join us. So Alvarro is a Mexican artist and researcher focused on biological networks and their change through time and space. With a background in molecular and cellular biology, he focuses on how the microscopic relates to the human and beyond. His work questions the notion of the natural, with projects spanning disparate landscapes, including corn, bodies of water, and currently the concept of weeds. He has a BA in molecular and cell biology from art from the University of California, Berkeley. He's currently pursuing an MFA in design media arts at the University of California, Los Angeles. All right, thank you so much, Alvarro.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Let me just get started. Thank you all for being here. This is such a pleasure to be in the presence of so many people talking about my work. So can everybody see my slides? Yes.
Yes, it's good.
Perfect. Then let's get started. So I was struggling a little on how to name this this presentation, and this is kind of my working title for my thesis project that I'm going to be working on for the next 2 months. And hopefully by the end of the lecture, it'll be clear why maize should be capitalized. So let's get started. And this is my website, and all my contact information is there if you have any questions or want to just have a conversation. So maybe I'd like to get started at the very beginning. So this is like when I started at UC Berkeley studying molecular cell biology. I got obsessed with microscopes and microscopy in general. And these are some of my first images that I was able to create using the green fluorescent protein molecule over here, which also like has been used has been such an influential molecule both in the sciences and the arts. So coming from this very like strict science background, I enjoyed looking at cells up close and kind of like seeing how they relate to the rest of the world. Something that wasn't encouraged as much in the sciences, at least in my discipline, was to ask more questions that are already there. So that's where the art component came to be. I was also able to travel to the Solomon Islands, which are a couple of islands off the coast of Australia. And they're these tiny little islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And I did my capstone project on food systems there, and that's where my passion for agriculture started. I always bring up these two examples. We were able to visit the Tepare, which is, they call themselves like the last wild island. And it's this research station that we were able to do a lot of research with turtles and with plants in general. And back in the Western province, which is up near like these types of islands, like it's neighboring Papua New Guinea, I was able to meet this farmer who, I always tell his story because it's such a fascinating piece of information that he was able to share, which is because the islands are coral based, soil is a precious commodity there. So he, without any like background in agriculture, was able to figure out that bat guano, which now has like a different connotation, bats in general. So bat manure was able to be used as fertilizer by using these like coconut husks. He was able to prevent runoff from the soil, and he was able to grow leafy greens, which require like really rich nutritious soil. So this was just like an example of like ingenuity where just people by like observing were able to see how they could impact their environment hands-on and directly. And he was just such a like wonderful inspiration for like the rest of my career, honestly. The next other inspiration is Pandurang Pankaj and Tina Molotti, which I came across this image from Tina Molotti, who's an Italian photographer who came to Mexico and lived in Mexico for the rest of her life. She did this collaboration with Pandurang, who was a maize geneticist, and he has one of the most fascinating histories that I've ever encountered. There's like one book that I was able to collect from the library, but there's no more copies available online, and it's such an interesting, he has such an interesting history. I've been in contact with their family, with his family and relatives, but this hasn't like cemented in anything yet. But Tina Molotti and Pandurang were able to collaborate on this specific topic, which is maize, and creating hybrid species that would produce like higher yielding maize in Mexico specifically. So, and this image on the left was one of the first images that where I like finally like drew, like inspired that like passion for maize itself. So I just like to bring that up because it's kind of like where I started out. And jumping all the way back, all the way towards today, and mainly like asking the question like why maize is important and why we should consider maize as a vital, like give it like more of an importance in our day-to-day conversation. This variety of maize is called the Oloton maize, and it's present. It's in Oaxaca and in the Tontotepec community. It has grown it and cultivated for thousands of years. Uh, it became like it's still an issue of conversation because in recent years, the University of California, Davis, and the Mars Company conducted research to potentially lead to a patent for this maize variety, which has this super unique ability that it grows aerial roots that produces mucus-like substance that is able to harbor beneficial microorganisms that absorb nitrogen from the atmosphere and sequester it in the plant itself. So the implications of this maize could be like global, and just like how this is being addressed is one of my main areas of focus in my thesis. And I just think it's such a fascinating intersection between like the institution and where that comes into like governing biological bodies. So I think this is such a great example. And if anyone's interested, there's this Yale article that introduces these topics pretty well. Yeah. So another question. So why maize? One of the answers is because it's in every single thing that we consume and use. This is just an example from Iowa State University that just breaks down where corn is used in our day-to-day life. So all the way from industrial things like popcorn to tortillas to soap to oil to medicines, and one of the most important things in the U.S. is as feed for animal stock. So maize is one of the most widely grown plants on the planet. And in the US, of course, there's like such a deep connection between maize, which is also called corn, uh, and its culture and its language. So I came from Mexico City. I was born and raised there, and kind of this migration that I went across by crossing Mexico to the US was something that maize experienced in a similar way, which I kind of became drawn to. And this all started with huitlacoche, which huitlacoche, for those of you who don't know, is this corn, it's a corn smut. It's also called corn smut. And it's this fungus that grows on corn, and it creates these tumor-like growths that produces pigmented like granules. And in Mexico, it's seen as a delicacy in like and it has like a higher value is economically speaking. But also in the US, it's seen as an issue where the first presence of corn smut in any field would be almost immediately burnt down previously. And it was also known as the devil's corn. And this kind of like transformed over the years when they found that there's a higher value for maize, and it started to be relabeled as Mexican caviar or the Aztec caviar, which I just found that like that history fascinating. And this piece itself here is an agar gel petri dish sculpture that I used. So I created this sculpture out of with I modeled it out with huitlacoche, and it grows colonies of bacteria on top of it. So this is huitlacoche, and this is how it's seen in the grocery stores in Mexico. In the US, you can only buy canned versions, and it's not as good. So I would recommend if you're in Mexico, try it out. And another reason why huitlacoche is vital, especially in the sciences, and I know that there's a lot of people in the sciences right now with us here with us today, is that it's used as a model organism for a lot of research, especially in cancer, because it grows tumor-like growth. So a lot of especially the BRCA2 gene was discovered using huitlacoche, which is also the scientific name is Ustilago mayadis. So there's a lot of research going on there and a lot of interest in terms of how these molecular patterns occurred within the Huitlacoche. So I just found that fascinating, and that's one of the first projects that I was able to do like directly related to maize. So going a little bit further on to 2019, this was one of the first pieces that I was able to create at DMA and UCLA. And it was based off the monografía, and these are like papers that are sold in papelerias, which are stationery stores. That's close as I got to the translation, which there are these like big images that have text in the background and kind of depict the story of something, either like a historical character or like an event that happened. And I became obsessed with how in Mexico City, where I was born and raised, there was always this history and this, which became like almost like folklore, that there was these giant lake systems on top of the city, and that they were drained. And one of my main questions, and this is kind of like how I practice most of my projects, is by asking questions. One of my main questions was, where did the water go, and how do you drain a lake? And basically, this led me down a rabbit hole on a historical, like a history archiving process of going all the way from the 1500s to pre-contact Mexico, all the way to 2018, where one of the largest infrastructure projects in Mexico's history was recently accomplished, and most people don't even talk about it, which is the Túnel Emisor Oriente, which is depicted here on the right. And the airport became like a really hot topic for controversy because it was sitting on top of the last remnants of the lake. And I'm not going to go into those different conversations because that's for another time. But this was one of the first projects, and this is all done on top of a 1 meter long tortilla that I laser etched this history onto it, and it obviously decomposed, and it's now part of the earth. Then I made this series, which is part of Milpa in 2020, and it's depicting the similar story but in a different context. And these tortillas were properly dried, so they're still preserved, and they still have the potential to decompose, but they still up to this day, and now it's been like a year after I made them, or 2 years, they're still like perfectly intact, and most of them, except for the ones that were able to like crumble up. So just looking at the history of this lake system all the way from the 1500s to the 2018 was one of my projects that I worked on last year. And I just found this history super complex because it was mainly talked about the encounter of the Spanish and the indigenous communities in Mexico, mainly the Mexicas, and how observing your landscape and how they identified certain objects and animals and just like their ecosystem in general, completely changed how they applied different policies on what was the priority in terms of either draining the lake or preserving the lake system. So then I moved on to weeds, and this started when the pandemic started. As all of us know, we were locked in almost pretty immediately, and I had this like yearning to like for the outside that I wasn't having this connection to. So during my like walks to the grocery stores, I started to notice that just because the city stopped taking care of plants growing on the streets, they just started to bloom all over the place. And I just started to observe them and kind of ask questions of like I wanted to learn their names, I wanted to learn where they came from, and I wanted to learn like what their purposes and uses are. And this, for example, is a runoff water that was present in like a place near Wilshire. And these plants just almost immediately grow in like 3 to 4 days, which I just found fascinating. And they're present all over the US, and I just found them like fascinating. In terms of the research side of it, because there's always the practical side and the research side for me, and sometimes I focus too much on the research side, as some people might tell you, but I find the complexities of these issues deserve this time and attention and care. So for example, when I first encounter a problem, obviously the first thing that I want to do is like definitions. And the definition of a weed, I'm not sure if this box is blocking the view from everyone, but the definition of a weed in this paper that I found in Access from 2020 Was an herbaceous plant not valued for use or beauty, growing wild and rank, and regarded as cumbering the ground, hindering the growth of superior vegetation. So there was kind of this angle of superiority and beauty related to what a weed was. And I just found this like fascinating because it was like one of the first definitions from the ninth century. And then of course it transformed into like more ecological damaging plants, and also yeah, economically damaging plants. That was like kind of like if a plant was getting in the way of like ecosystems um, or of some other plant of value, uh, mainly agricultural plants, that's when it became an issue. So because if we were to take the broad definition of a plant that comes from somewhere else and it grows and transforms the whole ecosystem to its detriment, any agricultural, well, most agricultural plants would be considered weeds. So that's something that I found interesting, and it was kind of a tangent that I took that was necessary for me to like develop my relationship with plants. And this kind of led me to this idea that was introduced by one of the people from the UCLA Botanical Gardens that I've been working with, which is plant blindness, and just how people don't necessarily see plants as valid of their time. So I just found that super fascinating and wanted to like see why some, also like why some plants deserve more attention than others. And that was kind of like where this whole project started. So I just started taking pictures everywhere on my walks and started to collect a couple of them. And I created this project called the Sidewalk Herbarium. And an herbarium is usually used in botanical gardens. They have like giant collections of pressed plants that are dried. And usually, as of now, they're starting to digitize most of the images, but there's also this element of, because it's like a physical plant material, you can also incorporate some sort of like genetics into it. And it's this kind of like database of thousands and thousands of years, well, thousands of years of just collecting plants being collected by humans. And I would recommend, if anyone's near a botanical garden in the future, when things open up, of course, I would recommend you to try to go visit the herbariums, because they're fascinating places with just like giant storage spaces. The one in New York, the New York Botanical Gardens, is one of the best ones. I haven't been, but hopefully I'll go soon. But yeah, and then I started to collect data, as my science background would like want me to, and just starting to like look at what is native, what is introduced, and what is other. So kind of this is when certain definitions start to break down for me. So what does it mean to become native, be native to a place? What does it mean to like move into a place? And what does it mean to be hybrid? So like being both native and introduced. So this is kind of like where I really went into definitions and kind of wanted to explore that the different complexities in especially biological or botanical definitions, and how they changes like a conversation within like whether a plant belongs or doesn't in a specific space. So again, I started to collect, these are a couple of my scans that I was able to collect and press. I did a digital herbarium where I collected as many plants as I could, traced them to their different origin spaces. And what I found is that a lot of them were like native to California, and they were just growing there in a space that potentially wasn't theirs to be in. And especially like this is the tall flat sage, which is the plant that I was mentioning that grows when there's like runoff water. So I started to see these invasive species not as the problem themselves, but as symptoms of a larger issue. For example, the tall flat sedge, like the main issue was that there was runoff water from people over watering their gardens, and that running off into the streets, and then creating habitat so that this plant can grow in that space. So it's not necessarily that the plant should be vilified, but that the cause of it should be reassessed and seen as like the main issue itself. So and this is one of the posters that I was able to create for the Sidewalk Herbarium using 3D modeling. This was done in I think Cinema 4D. I think this is when I started using Cinema 4D. And yeah, I got obsessed with using like glass shapes to kind of like use the distortion of optics in the language that I was embedding into the posters. So And I was also able to create a couple of workshops, and I know Victoria is here, and I was able to collaborate with Victoria on some of the workshops, and they're available online. This was just one that I was able to give on just like how to go out and collect different invasive species and create your own sidewalk herbarium using very simple materials. That's what I wanted to do, and make it like as accessible as possible, so that people can just kind of like understand their ecosystems and understand that urban ecosystems are valid ecosystems as well. So I'm not going to play any of it because I think I think it's like 20 minutes long. So, but it's available on my website if anyone's interested. Oh, no, apparently it is streams. So then this all cemented itself into the invasive species paradigm, which was one of my shows last year, also in the pandemic. And of course, since we couldn't be in spaces together, this was all digital. And this was one of the animations that I was able to create using all of my different scans from my herbarium, and kind of alluding to this collapse and reconstruction um, that's like constantly going within under our feet without us noticing. So, and I was also able to create this large archive of the different data points that I was collecting from all the way from like interviews, lectures that I was giving, these like images that I was taking of the plants, different conversations that I was having with particular artists like Maru Garcia. She was very influential in this project. So looking at the different angles of what it means to understand a topic was one of the core things that I was trying to understand. And this is what kind of cemented in this project, this pretty big project called the Invasive Species Paradigm. And I'm just gonna give a couple of seconds in this website, and this is available online for anyone who wants to see. Hopefully this is still sharing. Yes, okay. Yeah, and this is the animation that I was working with. You kind of scroll down, and then we have a couple of these, this like live database that I was working with to kind of create, to visualize everything that I was trying to understand, like how I was trying to understand this very complex situation, because of course there, I'm not trying to like beautify or like encourage people to grow weeds, but I'm trying to like understand their complex history. And these are a couple of interviews, Jules Cooch as one of them. And at the very bottom, there's a couple of sidewalk herbarium talks, a conversation, and this is the tutorial that I was able to give, and just sources, because of course the research side of my practice is always essential. So I always have a long list of sources, which most people, it's difficult for people to get excited about sources sometimes, but I do find them fascinating. So then I'm moving on back to maize. I know that this has been a long conversation, so I'm going to try to keep this as short as possible. So this is one of the quotes from Francisco Hernandez, who was born from the 1550s to 1587. And he's one of the naturalists that was sent by the kings of Spain to analyze what the landscape was. So he created one of the largest catalogs of plant life within La Nueva España, which is what is current day Mexico. And he wrote this about tlaoyi, which is maize, and I translated it into English here. So he says, but I do not say this in contempt of the tlaoyi, because far from it, reproaching it, I praise it greatly. And this just a little bit of context. All foods that were indigenous to the land were seen as not healthy at the time, and were seen as detrimental to the Spanish people's health. So there was kind of this bias that if Spanish people would ingest non-Spanish food, that they would become indigenous. Like there was like, this like incredible like misbelief. And then he goes on to say, like, I do not understand how the Spaniards, diligent imitators of the foreign, and who so well know how to take advantage of the inventions of others, have not adapted to their uses, nor have brought their land to their lands and cultivated this type of grain. So this is at a point where maize was not seen as this like widely spread grain that was super nutritious. And I think there was just such a like weird contradiction between like how it's viewed, it was viewed then and how it's viewed now. And there's this super interesting, I'm not going to go too much into it, but this interesting thing with nixtamalization, which is the process of maize being transformed into like masa, which is what is used for tortillas, that releases an essential amino acid. And the Spanish did not know about this, so they didn't have access to this essential amino acid, which prevented them from like absorbing as much nutrition from the maize as possible. So I just found that fascinating, and this all came from conversations with scientists. That's something that I usually do. I just email people from, like, depending on their all over the world. Right now I've been in contact with a lot of people from Texas A&M, which they study a lot of maize. So there's two scientists that I've been working with closely for my thesis project. So I just found it fascinating. And then I was also able to create this project, which is called From Teosinte to Sea Maize. And this was exploring our coevolution across the domestication gradient. So looking at how we, as Homo sapiens sapiens, co-evolved with Z maize, which is maize or corn. So looking at how our relationship with this grain completely transformed our way of cultivating the seeds, and then the maize itself transforming how we take care of it. So there's kind of this like coevolution theory that is present here, and how we were able to transform Balsas teosinte, which is the ancestor of maize, depicted here on the left, and going all the way to maize or corn as we see it in the US. So going through, and these are terms used by botanists studying maize themselves. So like Balsas teosinte to Mexican land races, then into US land races, US inbred lines, into superior inbred lines, and then into genetically modified maize. So this is, and genetically modifying organisms is not something that's new. It's been done over 9,000 years by this collaboration between indigenous communities, mostly, especially for maize in the Balsas River Valley, all the way till today, where in specific indigenous communities have super adapted their species for their specific spot. So depending on, for example, for the Oloton maize, there is a need for this really low clouds because it's up in the mountains, for it to have this like really humid environment, so that the maize can absorb and keep this like mucus-like substance humid. So there's such a specificity in terms of where maize is grown, and to think that you can just like copy and paste it somewhere else, I think that's one of our things that we have to re-examine. So our relationship with maize needs to be re-examined. And this is just looking at 3 different examples. For example, this is from the, I'm gonna go into it, yeah. I'm just gonna, yeah. This first tortilla is the nomenclature tortilla, which I find one of the most fascinating ones. And this is used by the USDA, and these are different terms that are used in terms of to identify specific seeds. And I just found it fascinating how it went from names like Tlalpita, Rodeo, Palomero Tolupeño, all the way to W438 to B76. This kind of like depersonalization and dehumanization of the seeds, I just found fascinating, and I just wanted to address that. And this, just for in case people are interested, it are columns that are used, are in place at the US state capitol. So at the very top, they have maize decorating the corn cobs decorating the top of the pillar in a very like Greco-Roman style. And yeah, I just found that fascinating. So I'm not going to spend too much time because I'm like, oh yeah. And this is going on to like newer stuff, which this is kind of what I've been working on for the past couple of months. And the US National Plant Germplasm System is a service done by the USDA, so this is the United States Department of Agriculture, that provides seeds from all different parts of the world to people to kind of like improve the biodiversity of a specific garden, and kind of like it's usually done for research, but it's also a free service that's done for anyone with a garden. So I would highly encourage people to like explore. In case you're interested in starting a garden, this is a place that provides free seeds. So I was able to collect a couple of them from focusing on Mexico and the US. So I collected a couple, like a lot from Mexico, just to see like the diversity of these seeds. A couple from Florida, Indiana, Iowa, and Colorado. I wasn't able to find any from California, but maybe I'll have to find, I'll search a little harder. But yeah, this is kind of like my how I was able to start to collect the different seeds. And they come in these individual packages that have their names, QR codes, and this kind of like a depersonalized way of presenting this information, which is also present in the seeds themselves, like physically, not just by the color, but by the texture and the shape of the seeds, which I found fascinating. And I was able to collect all of these. And this is a project that I've been working with the UCLA Botanical Gardens, and we're going to be growing maize. And this is just a quick little poster. I'm going to be growing both teosinte, which is the ancestor of maize, in relationship to these 5 seeds that I was able to select from the ones that you saw before. Going all the way from, this is like a Oaxacan variety, so it's called Oaxaca 89, I think, 99. To Sinaloa, which is where my mom's from. So I just wanted to add like that little personal touch, all the way to Palomero Toluqueño, which is from Mexico City, to this variety that's called Super Gold from Indiana, and this variety from China, which is completely yellow and super hard seeds. And something that I found really interesting that people might find interesting is this kind of transformation from color, especially from like this like white pale color to the yellow. And it's something that I did not know, is that the white variety of seeds have a higher starch content. And that's why it's like used mainly in Mexico, because it's corn is mainly used for tortillas and for pozole. So kind of like using this as a more starchy variety of maize. And in the US and other like more industrial agriculture societies, it's used for animal feed. So and the yellow corn variety has a higher protein content. So that's why there's a very clear distinction between both varieties. And I'm still searching for these are red seeds from Iowa, which I just found gorgeous. So I'm also going to grow them as well together. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have in terms of information. I have a couple of things I want to show because I started sprouting my seeds already, and I think it's such an interesting thing to see life come out of a seed. So I just wanted to show a couple of the sprouts, especially the teosinte sprouts are fascinating. And so I'm going to switch cameras. And oh, just one last thing. I'm also going to be giving a presentation, workshop on bioplastics. So I've also been working on bioplastics and using especially cornstarch and different other materials to create bioplastics. And this is something sponsored by Culture Hub, and it's going to be next Saturday. And it's just going to be a workshop, so like walking you through creating your own bioplastics, and we're going to have a conversation on our dependence on petrochemicals and especially fertilizers, and just it's going to be a good time. So if you want to enroll, this is the link, and I can share it in the chat after. So let me just stop my screen sharing and let me move on to the second camera. So it's going to be the one labeled Alvaro. I don't know if you can see it already. It's right here. Yeah, there's my hand. So I'll just talk through this, I think, if it's going to work. Can you see? No? Would it be possible to pin the Alvaro with the seeds or spotlight? I think that's...
Yeah, let's do that. I just pinned it, but yeah, let me spotlight it here. There we go.
Okay. So these are the teosinte seeds, and they have a really hard seed coat. And usually they're perennial, and that means that they grow more than once a year. But these are annual teosinte seeds. And as you can see, there's like tiny little roots coming out of it. I just sprouted these like 2 days ago, and I have this incubator that I was able to get. And you can just see like start to see like little roots, which I just find fascinating. And so for these seeds to grow, you have to like take away some of the seed coat so that the root can leave the seed. Usually it's eaten by different animals or organisms, specifically birds. And through their digestive system, that seed coat is disintegrated and then excreted, and then that plant can grow again. And let me see if I can show you a little bit more. This is, and these changed within. So these are the ones from Sinaloa, and these are the starchy variety. As you can see, these grew from like this morning. So you can, this little sprout that you can see here, there, was not there this morning. So you can see that this is a very rapid process. So I encourage everyone, if you haven't ever like grown seeds from scratch, to try it out. It's such a rewarding experience. Let me see if I can find the red ones. Which also like are super fascinating because the root started to grow red and then it turned a different color. So yeah, just I wanted to show a couple of them just because I find them fascinating. And the small ones, yeah, these are still in process. But yeah, that's pretty much it in terms of what I wanted to show. But if there's any questions, I would love to answer them and just have like a conversation with everyone here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know I have questions, but I want to leave it open to students first who might have some questions. Does anybody have any questions? You can also put it in the chat too, by the way. I don't know if people are getting shy, but one of my questions actually was just, this is all just so fascinating and just so interesting. Like, I come from an agricultural background, so I just love it anytime anybody is, asking these questions and, probing these topics with like an art mindset too. So I was just really curious too, like, how did you always know that you were going to sort of double major or do both, like plant science and art?
So specifically plant sciences, no, but in terms of art and science, ever since I was little, there was, and this is, I think, a flaw within our educational system. I really enjoy doing both. So kind of the art classes and the science classes, and try to do as much as I could out of both. So my time was kind of like very limited in terms of what I could do outside of those two. But I really appreciated this kind of like having both spaces for inquiry. But it wasn't until college where I just started to put them together without any context. It was just, I started especially with molecules because that was kind of what I was studying at the time. And from that, I took one of my most influential classes that I took as an undergrad was this agroecology class. And it was one of the last times that one of the professors taught that class because studies in agriculture in Berkeley specifically were transitioning from agroecology, which is using ecological principles to aid agriculture, to a more genetically leaning program, which is of course where most of the money is. So I understand where they were coming from. But that was one of the first classes that I ever like started to look at plants in a different context. I was just completely fascinated by just how these principles that were taught to me in like a science context could be applied to something that was practical. And I just started asking questions about like why this was not the case. And food justice is also like been at the core of several of my issues, and how important it is for people to be connected to growing food and how empowering that can be. So yeah, that was a really long answer to the question, but I think there was always been like this inkling for combining all three elements. But for me, it was kind of like separated by, when I was a little kid, by the educational system. So
Yeah, no, that's great. I have other questions too, but I'll let one of the students ask. Oh, is there a link to the website with the paradigm image in the weeds?
yes, let me just share the links that I have. Yeah, that's
I actually have a question, but I have to admit I'm not a student, if that's all right.
That is all right. Yes.
So first of
Absolutely.
all, I found that fascinating. I really appreciate your taking the time to present. A good percentage of the audience here is in the class that I'm co-teaching with Professor Holmlund. And before I ask the question, I have the true confessions. I'm neither an artist nor a scientist. I'm a social scientist. And you had me at the very beginning with a very provocative title, maize should be capitalized. And I immediately thought there's two ways of understanding that title, i.e. maize is important enough that it should be capitalized. We should understand its importance. And the other is it should be capitalized in an economic sense. And I just wonder if you've explored the degree to which maize has been too capitalized. So whether it's corn syrup or ethanol or livestock feed, it's arguably been too successful.
Mm-hmm.
And whether any of your art projects, you've explored that angle of the maize story.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for such a great question. I think there's two ways of understanding that the title, especially with how we identify what maize is, because of course there is this issue with overabundance of maize in terms of the U.S. economy, and especially like U.S. and China are the number 1 and 2 producers of maize in the world, and of course there's like huge detrimental consequences to just producing maize itself, especially as a monoculture. So for me, maize with the capital M, there's some sort of distinction between maize with the capital M and corn. Corn, it's for me, is kind of seen as this, as was seen in the tortilla with the U.S. state capital, state capital columns. So that's seen as this kind of like venerated object for economic purposes. But maize with a capital M is seen as something that's used, that has its super complex history, rooted in indigenous practices, rooted with collaboration within the land and the plant itself, and is something that maybe that's the maize that I address that should be capitalized, not not corn itself. So there's different ways of understanding what maize is, and that's kind of like at the core. And I really appreciate this kind of like spotlight on the terminology itself, because there's such an interesting variety between like how we name plants, and taxonomies especially is something that I've researched quite a bit. And in terms of like how it reduces a plant to a super broad category, where if you say something like Z maize, which is a scientific name for corn, it just overarches like so many different varieties that you couldn't necessarily identify them when they're like next to each other. But when you say corn, there's like an image that immediately goes into your head, this like super bright yellow, perfectly symmetrical, corn cobs growing in rows, this like huge monoculture, the corn belt, corn fed. There's like so many different connotations that come by with like the US context, and how this capital M maize is transformed into this corn is something that I find absolutely fascinating, and just like kind of like that mimicking the migration of peoples, specifically translating into like this, how Mexicans are viewed in the US, I think is such a fascinating topic of conversation to have, especially when corn is in everything, but we don't even consider its roots until like where they came from, and how many thousands of years of indigenous care and nurturing of this plant had to take for that, so that someone can just like take a bunch of seeds and then grow them in this like one specific variety that obviously is not a sustainable solution. But yeah.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? We've got a few more minutes.
Yeah, I have a brief question. First of all, just really want to say I love the presentation. I found the page with the Teosinte de Z maize, the nomenclature, where it runs from the Mexican land races. I'm looking at it right now on my other monitor, to the inbred lines, really fascinating, and it sort of goes along with your last response to the last question. I was wondering if you could elaborate whether you think that sort of industrialization of the names is sort of a reflection of the diversity of like the strains increasing, or if you think that's sort of just a byproduct of sort of the relationship with something that had a name to something that is just sort of exported, like maybe even if it's easier for something that's named, you know, W438 to be grown, so far from where it came from. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on your thoughts a little bit more.
Yeah, if I'm understanding the question correctly, for me, there's this kind of like, there's this sense of depersonalization within the maze itself when you give it a name that's encoded in like letters and numbers. And this kind of depersonalization just like highlights this disconnect between like our relationship with the natural world, in the way that we don't give it enough importance that we should call it by a specific name, but we can encode it and classify it as a category in as a category in sorry, my screens just jumped around. As something that can be hyper categorized into a specific something that's only used for productivity wise. So it doesn't have its history on like the people that grew the corn. It doesn't have the history on where it was grown, like what like these traces that make maize like a living being and an entity in that should be valued for its history and its context and like how like its relationship with people and this like coevolution and this kind of like pact that we had with plants is completely thrown out of the door when you just call it MO623. And I think that's like, for me, there's enough words in the English and Spanish language that we can call things by specific names, like Palomero Toluqueño, one, two, like there's even in like certain the seeds that I'm using, like Oaxaca 83, it's still, there's a codified, like there's a number, a coded number that is used in this place, but there is still this kind of relationship to where it came from and the people that grew it. So for me, if I understand the question correctly, I think there's like a lot more there to be said about this kind of like mistranslation and this kind of depersonalization and like how we relate to the plant itself. So yeah, hopefully that answered the question, but yeah.
We have a question in the chat too.
Yes, I just saw. So Chase Johnson, thank you for your presentation. I'm interested in the shortcomings of the educational system. You alluded to your response earlier. Do you think elementary and high school students should teach students to grow food? If so, how do you imagine that could look like? This is such a great question, and I really appreciate that question, Chase. So yes, I do believe there should be like an implemented food studies program across like our education system, not just in high school or like university program, but all throughout our educational process. I was lucky enough to be able to have access to a garden when I was in elementary school, and I know a couple of people who have worked with teaching elementary students about gardening, and there's just this sense of awe and that just doesn't translate into understanding where food systems come from, but they transform into understanding what worms do, like how do plants grow, like asking questions about what is this food, like why does this bird want this plant, like, and this space just provides a space for so that people can start to ask questions. And I think that in itself is already like like so valuable, and also to be able to work with your hands and like connect to the earth and connect to like actually growing food, and not even like just scientifically, but also like socially, like learning about like how much labor it takes to like pull specific plants so that plants can grow, how much labor it takes to like water specific plants, and how much labor it takes for like things that we don't even consider. Like we just assume that things show up in the grocery store, but we don't even track the chain of people that were were paid way below minimum wage and had to suffer horrible circumstances, especially right now in the pandemics and the fires. So that kind of relationship within just learning about how plant grows, I think has so many layers of value that should be addressed. And I would encourage everyone to look at Ron Finley. He's an urban gardener I've had the pleasure to meet and work with, and he does amazing lecture series and TED Talks on the importance of growing your own food. And I'm going to point you in his direction. He has this project, and the Ron Finley project And I would highly recommend everyone who's interested in growing your own food to check out his site. So there's another question. Some rural schools have things like Future Farmers of America in middle school and high school, and often work in 4-H clubs and state agencies. This is common in Montana. Yes, I've heard. I was not aware of this when I came to Berkeley when I went to Berkeley as an undergrad. But when they started to tell me about these things, I was completely fascinated by especially one of my best friends as an undergrad was part of these different clubs, and how it was mainly focused on productivity and kind of like increasing yields and like this kind of like more like economic way of understanding what agriculture is, which I'm not sure if that's the case for state countrywide, but that's kind of like what I heard from a specific spot in California, in Northern California. So I just found this like completely fascinating in terms of like how we see our food system as inputs and outputs and not as us taking care of this organism that is taking care of us in exchange. So that I will also like link just because now I'm there's so many like resources that are coming out. So let me find the article for. But in the meantime, if you have any like last questions, or we still have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I was gonna just
Question-
mention. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It's okay,
You
go
can go ahead,
ahead.
Helen.
Well, and again, I can wait if there are other student questions, but Alvaro, again, just thank you so much. This was just incredible, and I can't thank you enough. I was, so fascinated on the edge of my seat the entire time. But one of the things that really struck me as especially powerful about about all your projects, but especially the ones where the project was done on a corn tortilla. And I was really struck by that because like in our class, we've been talking a lot about sustainability and, long-term impacts of humans on the planet. But, for these projects, like you said, either they have already decomposed or they could decompose eventually. And I thought that was a really, really powerful statement and a humble approach to art. Like, you don't have to make a project that will have a long impact on the planet. Would you like to kind of share that experience? Is it like, what is it like to see your art decompose?
Yes, so it is this kind of, because of course having this background in the arts, there's kind of this notion that you have to have this object that's going to be like permanent in the culture of the future culture of society. But I think and it is this kind of like nerve-wracking thing to kind of like want to preserve things as much as possible so that it lasts as long as possible. But I think for me, especially when I was developing the concept for the tortilla scroll, so like the tortilla monografia, it was kind of I was kind of like looking at this analogy to history and how if we don't revisit history continuously, it gets lost. So just by having something like in a book, in a library that no one's going to check out, it's as good as like just being underground and kind of decomposing itself into the ground. But for me, this kind of a way of addressing making in terms of having it to revisit every time that you want to address these topics and being able to make edits and being able to like revisit like what this concept means right now in our present day, I think was one of the most interesting things that came up ideologically. But also like sustainability wise, for me now it's become incredibly hard, especially considering the circumstances of the planet that we live in, to use materials that aren't necessarily gonna go back into the earth, and being considerate of what you're using, so that thousands of years from now, maybe like this piece that you made, which might be or not be as important as it was a couple of years ago, can kind of be at peace with it just like going into the ground and going back. Sorry, I got a little distracted from the chat, but I think it's for me, like using something that will stay for thousands of years. I don't feel at peace with that, so I'm always trying to find like new materials, and by also exploring these new materials, you might discover something that maybe some like engineers that didn't have the ability to explore as freely as artists do can just come into contact with them and kind of push that idea of materiality in a different way. So there's a lot of benefits to thinking outside of the box, especially sustainability wise.
Thank you so much. Wow, that's really powerful. And we had a follow-up to that question in the chat. By making something that decomposes, are you also encouraging more artists to make new iterations of your original idea?
Yes, yeah, I think it's because this is all about creating the connections, and I know that's something that I get from Victoria, and I don't know if she's still here, but how everything is connected and how you're not necessarily like working by yourself in this like isolated space, which is also like kind of objectivity. I don't want to get into scientific objectivity, but there's this kind of like sense of you wanting to discover something that's authentic and original that nobody else has thought of. But I see it more as this kind of like wave where your discovery or your passion project or your thing is building off of people surrounding you, people that have worked on these things for thousands of years. People like, for example, like the seeds that I have are not just me, a relationship between me and the USDA. It's a relationship between me, the USDA, the people that probably without some indigenous communities' consent were able to retrieve the seeds, and those people that their parents and their parents and their parents were able to like cultivate and take care of in a very like direct way. So I think there is this kind of sense of just not wanting to be isolated by yourself and kind of be this kind of like genius model, which is kind of like what like a lot of artists strive for, but looking at it more of like making a wave that produces actual impact and change, not just at the like top level, but like at every level. So anytime that I give a talk or anytime that I give a lecture, the impact I have in just like cementing a couple of those ideas into people's minds can have a lot more power and impact than just being accoladed with like prestige, which that's not what I'm looking for. So
Thank you.
so yeah, I'm not precious about my ideas, so I do encourage collaboration. That's kind of at the answer. But yeah, are there any other last questions?
I'm going to give priority airtime to other folks since I took up quite a bit, but I do have just a comment that I was just going to ask if nobody else has anything. Okay. No, I was just going to comment like on the this is so wonderful, and I just want to talk to you about this all day actually, but I know we can't do that. But yeah, everything that you were talking about with like the education system is just really rings true for me personally too. Like so I mentioned in the chat the thing about FFA, Future Farmers of America. My mom used to teach high school, and she was the head of Future Homemakers of America, which is I think been rebranded now. But there was always this like love-hate relationship that I had to those things too, because like I came from an agricultural background, but my dad was into organic farming and ranching and biodynamics. But everybody at FFA, pretty much all their projects were sponsored by Monsanto. So it was like there was no ally really. And I don't really have a clear sense of what the state is of things like, you know, with those programs now, but you kind of brought up a good point that it is very much about capitalizing, you know, yields and things like that. And I'm just hoping that it changes. And I don't know if you've ever got a sense of that, or I know it's different too in like some of the Midwest and like Northwest states where we are right now versus California, but do you have a sense that it might be kind of leaning a little bit more into sustainability or organic or anything like that? Or is it still kind of?
Yeah. So I think to answer this question, it's important to look at subsidies and farm subsidies and where the money is going to. Obviously, like if you trace the money back into like where the US government is investing in prioritizing its money, it goes obviously into corn, which is mainly used. I think I don't remember the exact percentage, but it's like a super high percentage of the corn that it's not meant for human consumption, that it's mainly used for animal feed. So corn dairy farmers and corn farmers receive the largest amounts of subsidies, and all other types of produce or vegetables have. I think I saw that it was like almost less than a couple of like a very small percentage. I wish I had the numbers with me right now, but the fact that until like these numbers change, I don't see like our priorities being, because it's not just about organic food or sustainable food, but it's also about equal access and like how we distribute food, because of course there's like in wealthier neighborhoods there's access to like organic and healthy foods, but this is not the case in the entire United States. So these subsidies can definitely be like a linkage to like how, like where we're putting our money, especially as US citizens, where we put our money in is where our priorities lie. So that's kind of like where I'm like tracing it. Hopefully that'll change soon, but I haven't seen anything so far, but hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I feel like cautiously optimistic sometimes that there's things like, there's a magazine called Modern Farmer, and there's like all these other, all these other things I feel like are encouraged, like maybe a more holistic mindset. But then also if you poke around the USDA website, you kind of get a different sense of things. So
Yeah.
Cool. Does anybody else have any other questions? Anything else? I want to be cognizant of Alvaro's time.
No, just so that we don't end on a like sad note, I do think people are being more conscious about like social issues, and especially like how that they relate and are integrated into all components of life, not just a specific aspects of it. So I do think that there is a hope that people are going to see these issues, especially how we treat migrant workers, especially in agricultural fields, I think is just horrible. So I think there should be more attention to that. And I think there's a couple of Instagram pages that I can like maybe like share at another point that just call into attention these kinds of issues. And so I think that slowly we're becoming more conscious about like what we consume and where it comes from. And hopefully that'll cascade into like actual policy making and like how we grow our food. So I think there is a lot more work to do, but I do see ourselves going in like a slightly better direction. Just trying to be hopeful. I'm always trying to be hopeful.
That's wonderful. No, we need more of that. Thank you. Oh, could you pop the link in the chat for your workshop on the 17th?
Oh, yes.
I think everybody, I know I really want to come to that Culture Hub. For those of you who don't know, I mean, I guess we're not really in person, but it's downtown usually. That, they always have like really good events and residencies. And it's great that you're a part of the cohort for the Refest this year. That's wonderful.
Yes, I'm very excited. And there's some other amazing workshops. I know Caitlin Bryson from Art Science Center is also giving one on natural dyeing and invasive plants. I think that's the next Tuesday. So there's a lot of things to see and consider if you go into that link. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Alvaro. Really so lovely to have you here today.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining. Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is Victoria still here? Oh wait, no, I think
she
just left. Oh, wait, is Helen still here?
I am.
Oh, you are. I was gonna do a quick intro to Victoria, but I'll just do it over email. So Victoria runs the Art and Sci department at UCLA, and that's and just super cool. Always doing amazing things. It's really fun to creep on the website and see what's going on. What's going on?
That's awesome. And again, Alvaro, thank you so much. This is really incredible. I just I'll never think about maize the same way again.
Hopefully, yes, that's the goal. And I'll give you the Art Science Center website, just because there are like really cool events happening all the time. And I'm part of that group as well. So yeah.